A God-complex doctor, a $1.5 million secret, and a romantic anniversary hike that ended at the edge of a jagged cliff. Tonight, the Testicle Defense that shocked the nation. Did a respected anesthesiologist act in self-defense, or did he meticulously plan to bash his wife's skull in with a lava rock? The jury is out, the blood-soaked photos are in, and the doctor's own son is ready to testify. You won't believe the confession that changed everything. The high-stakes legal drama surrounding the attempted murder trial of Dr. Gerhard Koenig has reached a fever pitch as the public and the legal community alike wait for a definitive verdict. This case, which has captivated the nation, centers on a brutal and allegedly premeditated attack at a remote, treacherous cliffside location, a setting that was supposed to be the backdrop for a romantic anniversary getaway. Instead, the excursion ended in a blood-soaked struggle for survival, leaving a brilliant nuclear engineer, Ariel Koenig, with permanent physical and psychological scars. The defense presented by the doctor has been met with widespread skepticism and even derision, as he claims that the savage beating he inflicted upon his wife was a desperate act of self-defense. The core of his argument rests on a bizarre and graphic claim that his wife initiated a physical assault of such a specific and painful nature that he was forced to bash her head with a rock to secure his own safety. This narrative, however, stands in stark contrast to the harrowing evidence presented by the prosecution, which paints a picture of a controlling, jealous husband who orchestrated a deadly trap under the guise of reconciliation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the details of the incident were meticulously dissected. The prosecution's case is built on the foundation of a marriage fractured by suspicion and a husband's inability to cope with his wife's burgeoning independence. The alleged catalyst for this near-fatal encounter was what the doctor described as an emotional affair, a series of text messages between Ariel and a male colleague, while the defense characterizes these interactions as a betrayal that pushed a fragile man to the brink. The reality revealed in court was far more mundane. The communications centered on shared interests in music and professional topics, yet to a man obsessed with total access and absolute control, these innocuous exchanges were viewed as a declaration of war. This obsession led to a demand for complete transparency of her digital life and eventually a forced attempt at couples therapy. The narrative of a wackadoodle husband, as some observers have noted, emerged from testimony describing a man who could not tolerate his wife being the center of her own world, rather than a satellite orbiting his ego. As the investigative team delved deeper into the circumstances of that day, the sheer brutality of the attack became impossible to ignore. Eyewitness testimony from hikers who stumbled upon the scene provided a chilling look at the immediate aftermath. These impartial observers did not see a man defending himself. They saw a predator over his prey. They described hearing blood-curdling screams for help and witnessing a woman, her face masked in blood, crawling away from a man who seemed intent on finishing what he started. The hikers were so terrified by the doctor's demeanor and the violence of the scene that they fled for their own safety, convinced that they too might become targets. The physical evidence further corroborated this terrifying account. Photos of Ariel Koenig in the immediate aftermath of the assault show a woman whose skull had been subjected to traumatic force, with blood gushing from complex lacerations. The defense's attempt to downplay these injuries by focusing on the number of blows or the lack of a traditional skull fracture ignores the clinical reality of the trauma she endured. Expert testimony from forensic pathologists provided a sobering perspective on the nature of the injuries. While the defense argued that the photos looked worse than the actual medical damage, experts clarified that head injuries are notoriously deceptive. A complex laceration is not a simple cut. It is a violent splitting of the skin in multiple directions, requiring extensive stitching and resulting in permanent scarring where hair will never grow again. Furthermore, the presence of a broken thumb strongly suggests defensive posturing, a victim trying desperately to shield her head from a rain of blows delivered with a heavy lava rock. The technical concept of coup and contra coup injuries was introduced to explain how a brain can be severely damaged by being rattled inside the skull, even if the bone remains intact. This explains the disorientation and inability to walk observed in the victim, debunking the defense's suggestion that the lack of a, quote, shattered skull meant the attack was minor. The discrepancy between the doctor's claims of self-defense and the clinical reality of a defensive struggle has become a central pillar of the prosecution's quest for justice. The psychological profile of the defendant also came under intense scrutiny. As an anesthesiologist, Dr. Koenig occupied a position of immense trust and authority, a factor that often complicates how juries perceive professional defendants. However, the investigation revealed a history that suggests a pattern of transactional relationships and a deep-seated need for dominance. His previous marriage and his reaction to his wife's professional success as a nuclear engineer suggest a man who struggled with any dynamic where he was not the primary focus of power. The prosecution argues that the emotional affair was merely a convenient excuse for a man who had already begun researching the most dangerous hiking trails in the area, trails specifically marked with warnings to deter foot traffic. The choice of location for their anniversary was, according to the state, a calculated move to ensure that there would be no witnesses and no easy escape. The image of a doctor trained to preserve life, using his knowledge of the human body and the environment to plan its destruction, is a haunting centerpiece of this ongoing legal battle. The narrative of a husband simply trying to save a failing marriage through a romantic gesture began to crumble under the weight of his own post-incident conduct. Following the bloody encounter on the Poly Puka trail, Dr. Koenig did not seek medical aid for his wife or call for emergency services to report an alleged assault against his person. Instead, he vanished into the dense, unforgiving brush of the Hawaiian wilderness, playing a game of cat and mouse with law enforcement that lasted for hours. The prosecution highlighted this flight as a classic consciousness of guilt, arguing that an innocent man who had just fended off a lethal attack would have sought protection from the very hikers he encountered. Instead, he hid, a high-earning medical professional reduced to a fugitive in the woods, only emerging when he believed he could sneak away undetected. This behavior, the state argues, is not the reaction of a victim, but the calculated retreat of a man who realized his plan to stage a tragic accident had failed the moment his wife escaped his grasp. While the doctor remained in hiding, a series of frantic phone calls provided what many believe to be the, quote, smoking gun of the entire case. In a moment of apparent desperation or perhaps a misplaced need for confession, Koenig placed a FaceTime call to his own biological son. The testimony from this young man was nothing short of devastating for the defense. He recounted with chilling clarity his father stating plainly, "I tried to kill Ariel, but she got away." The defense's attempt to characterize this as a misunderstanding, attributing the confession to the whistling wind on a mountaintop, or a son misinterpreting his father's repetition of his wife's accusations, fell flat against the son's subsequent actions. He immediately contacted his biological mother and Ariel's family to warn them, a move that clearly indicated he believed his father was a present and lethal threat. When the doctor called back later to ask if the son had told anyone what was said, the mask of the innocent, confused husband slipped even further. Financial motives emerged as a secondary yet equally compelling layer to the prosecution's theory of premeditation. The courtroom became a battlefield of spreadsheets and insurance policies as the legal team sparred over who stood to gain more from the other's death. The defense pointed to a life insurance policy Ariel held on her husband, as well as her movement of $123,000 into a personal account following the attack, suggesting she was the one with a financial windfall in mind. However, investigative reporters unearthed a much larger figure that the defense seemed eager to gloss over: a $1.5 million life insurance policy that Dr. Koenig held on Ariel. Unlike her policy on him, this was a massive sum that would have significantly altered the doctor's financial landscape. Combined with evidence that he was a meticulous record keeper who had been obsessively reviewing his previous divorce settlements and alimony payments, the picture shifted from a crime of passion to one of cold, hard math. He wasn't just losing a wife. He was looking to avoid the financial bleed of a second divorce. The defense attorney, a seasoned former U.S. attorney, attempted to weave a tale of a, quote, paper dragon, arguing that the case was built on flimsy circumstantial evidence and the dramatic exaggerations of a woman looking for a payday. He went so far as to compare his client to the protagonist of the film The Fugitive, an innocent man forced to run because the system had already turned against him. This comparison was met with sharp rebuttals from legal experts who noted the fundamental difference. In the movies, the protagonist doesn't confess his crimes to his children on a recorded line. The defense's focus on the lack of a shattered skull or permanent brain damage was a strategic attempt to minimize the violence, but it failed to account for the complex lacerations described by forensic experts. These weren't mere scratches. They were deep, jagged wounds caused by the repeated impact of a blunt object, a lava rock, which required the victim to undergo emergency surgery and left her with a permanent bald patch where the skin was too scarred to ever recover. The psychological dimension of the trial took center stage when experts discussed the God complex, often attributed to high-level medical professionals like anesthesiologists. Dr. Koenig, a man used to having absolute control over life and death in a surgical setting, allegedly could not handle the loss of control in his domestic life. His wife's career as a nuclear engineer placed her on an equal intellectual and professional footing, a dynamic that investigators believe fueled his resentment. The emotional affair over text messages about the symphony and shared music wasn't a betrayal of the marriage so much as a betrayal of his total dominion over her thoughts and time. To a fragile ego, a wife having a work spouse or a close friend was an existential threat. The prosecution argued that the hike was not a romantic gesture, but a tactical choice, a location where her professional status and intelligence would mean nothing against his superior physical strength and the element of surprise on a narrow, restricted ledge. The forensic narrative continued to tighten around the defendant as the prosecution dismantled the notion that the injuries were anything less than a deliberate attempt to end a life. Expert testimony highlighted that while the human skull is remarkably resilient, the brain within is fragile, susceptible to the laws of physics that govern trauma. The concept of coup contra coup injury became a focal point, explaining to the jury how the brain sloshes against the interior of the cranium when the head is struck with high-velocity force. Even without a fracture, this internal collision causes bruising, swelling, and the profound disorientation witnessed by those who rescued Ariel on the trail. The defense's insistence that the lack of a shattered skull equated to a lack of intent was countered by the clinical reality of the weapon used, a heavy, jagged lava rock. Such an instrument is not chosen for a quick scuffle. It is a tool of convenience in a remote location, used to inflict maximum damage with minimal preparation. The prosecution argued that every strike to the head was a gamble with death, a gamble the doctor was more than qualified to understand given his medical training in anesthesia and vital signs. The courtroom atmosphere grew increasingly tense as the focus shifted to the specific self-defense claims made by the doctor. Taking the stand in his own defense is always a calculated risk, but the doctor's testimony was described by observers as a breathtaking display of audacity. He looked the jurors in the eye and recounted a story of being the victim of a sudden, violent sexual assault initiated by his wife on the cliff's edge. He claimed that the sheer pain and shock of her alleged grip on his anatomy left him with no choice but to reach for a nearby rock and strike her repeatedly. This testicle defense, as it was dubbed in the media, was met with incredulity by the prosecution, who noted the total absence of forensic corroboration. There were no bite marks, no bruising on the doctor, and no evidence of a struggle that favored his version of events. Instead, there was a woman with a broken thumb, an injury universally recognized by forensic pathologists as a defense wound, sustained while trying to ward off blows to the face and head. The physical evidence told a story of a woman shielding her life, while the doctor's story relied on a narrative that many viewed as a desperate, last-minute fabrication. Further undermining the defense's credibility was the mysterious disappearing syringe. During her initial statements, the victim recalled her husband attempting to inject her with a substance from a syringe with a clear barrel and a blue plunger, telling her to hold still. The defense made much of the fact that no such syringe, vial, or medical bag was ever recovered from the scene by hikers or the police. They used this omission to suggest that Ariel was hallucinating or lying to make the attack seem more, quote, sinister than a mere domestic dispute. However, the prosecution turned this around, suggesting that the doctor's hours spent hiding in the dense Hawaiian brush provided ample opportunity to dispose of incriminating medical supplies. As an anesthesiologist, he had easy access to paralytics and sedatives that could have rendered a victim helpless, making a fall from a cliff look like a tragic accidental slip. The absence of the syringe, they argued, was not proof of its non-existence, but rather proof of a calculated cleanup performed by a man who knew exactly what would look suspicious to a forensics team. The timeline of the anniversary hike was also meticulously reconstructed to show premeditation. The trail chosen was not a standard tourist path. It was a restricted area clearly marked with signs warning of the extreme danger and the potential for fatal falls. The prosecution presented evidence that the doctor had researched these specific danger zones in the weeks leading up to the trip, while the defense argued he was simply looking for a private, romantic spot to reconnect. The prosecution asked why a loving husband would ignore multiple no trespassing and danger signs to lead his wife to a ledge where a single shove would mean certain death. The romance of the setting was a facade, the state argued, designed to lure a woman who was already hesitant to go. Ariel's testimony revealed that she did not want to go on the hike, but was pressured by her husband's insistence that they needed quality time to move past their recent marital friction. This pressure, combined with his secret research into lethal terrain, painted the picture of a trap that had been weeks in the making. As the financial evidence was further unspooled, the true stakes of the marriage became clear. The $1.5 million life insurance policy held by the doctor on his wife was a staggering sum compared to the $125,000 policy she held on him. The defense's attempt to paint the victim as the greedy one, pointing to her moving funds after the attack, was reframed by the prosecution as a sensible act of self-preservation by a woman who realized her husband had just tried to kill her and was now a fugitive. They argued that a nuclear engineer with a high-paying career and no debt had no motive to stage a murder for a relatively small insurance payout. On the other hand, the doctor was facing the potential of a second divorce, which his own record showed he dreaded due to the financial bleed of his first settlement. By ending the marriage on that cliff, he wouldn't just be free of a wife he could no longer control. He would be a millionaire several times over, his assets protected, and his lifestyle upgraded. The prosecution's case concluded with the image of a man who saw his wife not as a partner, but as a liability to be liquidated in the most permanent way possible. The gravity of the situation reached its zenith as the legal teams presented their closing arguments, leaving the jury to grapple with two irreconcilable versions of reality. The prosecution's final push centered on the concept of control as a motive, a theme that had permeated every hour of testimony. They argued that the doctor's defense was not just a legal strategy, but a final attempt to exert dominance over his wife by humiliating her in a public forum. By concocting a story of sexual assault, the state claimed, he was attempting to assassinate her character since he had failed to assassinate her person. They reminded the jury of the office spouse testimony, noting that in a modern professional world, having a close colleague is a standard part of a high-functioning career. To frame shared lunches or discussions about the symphony as an emotional affair was characterized as the desperate reach of a man whose ego was so fragile it could not withstand his wife having a single thought or connection that he did not personally authorize. This psychological rigidity, they argued, was the true engine behind the violence on the Poly Puka trail. The trial's closing days also saw a profound focus on the role of the respected professional in criminal acts. The prosecution cautioned the jury against falling for the white coat bias, the inherent trust society places in doctors. They argued that Dr. Koenig used his specialized knowledge of human anatomy not to heal, but to target the most vulnerable parts of his wife's body with clinical precision. The forensic evidence of the complex lacerations and the coup contra coup brain rattling was presented one last time as the physical manifestation of a husband's rage. They emphasized that while he may be a skilled anesthesiologist who understands the nuances of the shaken baby mechanism and the physics of blunt force trauma, his status as a physician did not grant him immunity from the darker impulses of jealousy and greed. The state's narrative remained firm. This was a man who planned a perfect murder in a location where nature would take the blame, only to be thwarted by a woman whose will to live was stronger than his will to kill. In a final attempt to sway the verdict, the defense doubled down on the financial maneuvers and the alleged inconsistencies in the victim's account. They focused on the missing syringe, arguing that if such a terrifying detail were true, it would have been found. They painted the $1.5 million insurance policy as a standard financial planning tool for a man of his high income, rather than a price tag on his wife's life. They urged the jury to see their client as a man in a state of post-incident panic, a victim of a chaotic struggle who fled because he knew how the optics would look to a world that automatically sides with a bleeding woman. However, this comparison to a fugitive seeking justice was heavily weighed against the testimony of his son. The son's refusal to even address his father by name on the stand, referring to him only as the defendant, served as a chilling reminder that those who knew the doctor best were the ones most convinced of his lethal intent. The defense's paper dragon argument struggled to survive the heat of a son's conviction that his father had admitted to attempted murder. As the jury began their deliberations, the public was left to reflect on the broader implications of the case, particularly regarding domestic violence in high-income professional households. The trial of Dr. Koenig shattered the myth that such brutality is confined to specific socioeconomic brackets. It highlighted how control and stalking can manifest in sophisticated ways, such as a husband meticulously reviewing divorce laws and alimony payments while simultaneously planning a romantic hike to a restricted cliffside. The nuclear engineer and the respected doctor became symbols of a power struggle that ended in a shower of lava rock and a desperate crawl for help. The investigative team noted that the presence of impartial witnesses, the hikers, was the only thing that prevented this case from becoming another unsolved disappearance in the rugged terrain of the islands. Their presence forced a narrative that the doctor could not control despite his best efforts to hide in the woods and dispose of evidence. The wait for a verdict remains a period of intense reflection on the resilience of Ariel Koenig. Regardless of the legal outcome, the testimony established her as a woman who fought back with everything she had, using her hands to shield her head until her thumb snapped and her voice to scream until help arrived. The permanent scars on her scalp and the patch where hair will never grow serve as a lasting testament to the day her husband's God complex met its match. As the sun sets on the courthouse, the case stands as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones who have been trained to save lives. The nation now waits to see if the scales of justice will balance the weight of a lava rock and the chilling confession made to a son. The trial of Dr. Gerhard Koenig has exposed the dark underbelly of a seemingly perfect life, leaving a jury to decide if a doctor's hands are stained with the blood of a patient or the guilt of a failed execution.